They nailed the coffin shut twice. The first time had been for the dead. The second had been for everyone still afraid of him. By the time Eveline Morrow slipped into the crypt beneath St. Vay's ruined chapel, the iron nails driven across the black lid had already gone red with age. Wax from 100 warning candles had hardened over the carved seal. Salt lay in pale, cracked lines around the stone bier. Above it all, a painted warning in old church script bled across the wall. Do not wake what chose to sleep. Eveline read it by lantern light, breathing hard through the dust. Then she set her hand on the coffin anyway. Not because she was brave, because 10 minutes earlier her brother had been carried into the apothecary's shed coughing black into a rag, and the old women in the square had started whispering the same sentence they always whispered when Hollow Vale began to fail. The marrow blood brings ruin again. Eveline was 21 years old, the last daughter of a house no one in the valley admitted to respecting and no one dared entirely cast out. The villagers called her family cursed when they were drunk enough to be honest and old blood when they wanted something. They took their rents from marrow land. They used marrow wells in dry months. They came to marrow women when fevers turned strange. And then, when anything worsened, they crossed themselves and said the valley had never known peace since the blood-bound line took root under the hill. Her mother had died 3 winters ago, her father the winter before that. Her older brother Thomas now lay half-conscious with black blooming under his nails. And the physician, who had been paid, fed, sheltered, and excused by marrow coin for years, had looked at Eveline with tired, frightened eyes and said, "There are older remedies below St. Vay." Not remedies. That was not the word he had meant. He had meant bargains. The crypt smelled of old stone, wet earth, lamp oil, and forgotten incense. It was colder than the air outside, but not naturally so. The kind of cold made not by winter, but by long abstinence from sunlight. Eveline held the lantern higher and stared at the coffin resting under layers of black dust and old prayer. Everyone in Hollow Vale knew the story. A vampire lord had once ruled these woods before the chapels came, and the bells and the road taxes and the proper names. When war and plague swept the valley, he had not burned with the others. He had not fled. He had gone beneath St. Vay's hill of his own will and ordered himself sealed in iron and prayer after his household was butchered, and his enemies began feeding on his grief faster than he fed on blood. Some said he slept. Some said he starved. Some said what lay in the coffin was no longer a lord, but something grief had hollowed into a more dangerous shape. Children dared one another to touch the chapel door at dusk. Men swore by daylight they feared no dead noble. Women left silver nails at the steps every first frost, and no one in 70 years had opened the coffin. Until Eveline took the hammer from her satchel. The first nail screamed when she pulled it loose. The sound shot through the crypt like a living thing. She flinched and turned, half expecting the priest or the mayor, or half the village to come rushing down the stair and drag her back into the square for judgment. No one came. Above her, the storm pressed harder against the chapel roof. Thomas had maybe an hour, 2 if the fever chose mercy over speed. Eveline set the first nail down, then the second, then the third. By the 7th, her palms were torn. By the 10th, the lantern flame had begun to shake, though the air was still. By the 12th, she realized the coffin was warm. Not warm like sun-soaked wood. Warm like skin. Her breath caught. Every instinct in her body screamed to run. Every memory of Thomas coughing black into cloth dragged her hand back to the hammer. She wedged the claw beneath the last iron strip and pulled. The rotten wood splintered. The seal snapped. The lid shifted open with a long, slow groan. And something inside the coffin inhaled. Not theatrically, not with the gasp of a monster in a tale. With the deep, controlled breath of a man waking in a room he already knows he will dislike. Eveline staggered backward so fast the lantern nearly dropped from her hand. Darkness moved under the lid. Then two eyes opened. They were not red. That would have been easier. Red belonged to stories. Red was a warning given in simple language. His eyes were black at first, then dark wine as they adjusted to the light, the irises catching the lantern like polished garnet drowned in night. He lay still for one impossible second, face pale as carved ivory, black hair fallen loose across his temple, one gloved hand folded over the breast of a coat older than the chapel above him. There was no rot, no grave collapse, no snarling beast, just a man so unnaturally composed that the crypt itself seemed lesser for containing him. Then his gaze found Eveline, and the temperature in the room changed, not colder, attentive. The way silence changes when a predator decides it is finished pretending to be furniture. When he spoke, his voice was rough with sleep and old disuse. "Who," he said, "opened my coffin?" Eveline should have dropped to her knees, should have begged, should have lied. Instead, because she was tired and terrified and her brother was dying and she had spent too many years surviving other people's judgments to waste one more moment on graceful fear, she said the truth. "I did." The vampire lord stared at her for a long moment, then at the broken nails on the floor, then at the salt lines split by her boots. His mouth curved almost imperceptibly, not a smile, the shadow of one. Something with no kindness in it and strangely no immediate violence either. "That," he said, pushing himself upright with slow, unnerving control, "was obvious." She swallowed. Up close, closer now that he sat upright inside the black velvet rod of his coffin, he was worse than the stories had prepared her for. Beautiful, yes, but not gently. The kind of face men had once carved into coins and enemies had once imagined beheading. Hard mouth, sharp cheekbones, a scar silvered thinly under one eye, old enough to belong to another era. He moved with the terrifying economy of something that had once spent centuries at the top of a food chain and saw no reason to apologize for it. Eveline tightened her grip on the lantern. "My brother is dying." That got his attention, not sympathy, interest. "Is he?" Black fever, or rot fever, or cursed blood. No one agrees because agreement would require someone competent. Her words came faster now, fear making them too honest. The physician said the old vaults might hold remedies. "I came for whatever you have that can stop him. If I've made some catastrophic mistake, I am very sorry. But you were already in a coffin, and he is still alive, so I'm going to say his situation was more urgent." The crypt went very still. Then, to her horror, the vampire lord laughed. Not loudly, a single low broken sound, as if he had not used it in a very long time and found the shape rusty. "You woke me," he said, with a burglary speech. Eveline blinked. "I woke you," she said, because panic had now curdled into something dangerously like irritation. With desperation. The speech came free. His eyes moved over her face, then lower, taking in the rain on her cloak, the blood on her palms, the old morning black. She still wore half out of grief and half because the valley had never stopped expecting it. "What is your name?" "Eveline Marrow." That changed him. Not much. Enough. His posture sharpened by a fraction. His stare deepened into recognition of a kind she did not like. "Marrow," he repeated quietly. She fought the urge to step back. "Yes." "How many of you remain?" "2," she said. "For the moment." His gaze dropped to her torn hands on the lantern handle. When he spoke again, the roughness had gone from his voice. In its place was something colder, more awake. "You should have led with that." Before she could ask what that meant, he stood. No stumble, no weakness, no coffin-born disorientation. He rose in one smooth motion like the last 70 years had been a blink rather than a burial. Eveline took an involuntary step back. He noticed. Of course he did. "That," he said, climbing out of the coffin, "is at least a more sensible reaction." She hated that some part of her was relieved by the remark, relieved that he saw her fear and did not punish it, relieved that he sounded less like a dream thing and more like a very dangerous man. He stepped over the broken seal, looked once around the crypt, and his face went unreadable in a way that suggested rage had not weakened during sleep, only cooled into a more usable form. "They built a chapel over my dead," he said softly. "That was before me. I know." That should not have sounded merciful. It did. He took 2 steps toward her. The lantern light slid across black buttons, old leather, a ring on his right hand set with a stone the color of old blood. She had the absurd thought that he looked less like something risen from the grave than like the grave had been forced to release a king who had tolerated exile long enough. "What year is it?" she told him. He was silent for a beat, then another. When he spoke, his voice had gone so flat, it frightened her more than anger would have. "They left me down here 73 years. Eveline did not answer because there are some griefs a stranger should not rush to stand near. He looked at her once, sharply, and she understood in that instant that he had noticed her silence and judged it correctly. Not cowardice. Respect. "Take me to your brother," he said. She stared. "That's it." His brow lifted faintly. "Did you expect me to hiss at the moon first?" "I expected more resistance to being dragged from a coffin." "You are not dragging me anywhere, Miss Marrow." A pause. "And I have questions that are easier asked above ground." He took the lantern from her hand before she could protest. The theft was so smooth it barely registered. Then he looked at her bleeding palms and, with visible annoyance, not at her, she realized, but at the fact itself, took a linen square from his inner pocket and wrapped it once around her right hand. The gesture was not tender. That made it worse. Instinctive care from something ancient enough that instinct had likely been pared down to only the truths it trusted. Eveline went still. He tied the cloth with neat, efficient fingers and said without looking up, "If you faint on the chapel stairs, I'll be inconvenienced." That almost sounded like concern. It was logistics. He lifted the lantern. "Walk." The storm had worsened. Rain lashed the chapel roof. Wind drove needles of sleet across the graveyard. Hollow Vale below the hill looked like a scatter of dying lights half swallowed by fog. Eveline hurried down the stone path with the vampire lord at her side, and the deeply unhelpful awareness that no one in the valley would believe what she had done until it was much too late to matter. He moved silently over wet ground. That silence unnerved her more than any hiss or threat could have. Predators that want to frighten you make noise. Predators that no longer need the effort do not. "What was your house to mine?" she asked before caution could stop her. His gaze stayed on the road. Direct vassals once, then allies, then friends, depending on the generation. A beat. Your great-grandmother threw a bishop into a duck pond for trying to bless my threshold. Despite herself, Eveline laughed. He glanced down at her. The look did strange things to her pulse. You knew her? I knew all of them. The words settled between them like a second weather. All of them. Not stories, not ancestors painted into flat old portraits. People. He had known them breathing. The realization made the valley feel abruptly deeper, older, layered with invisible histories the church and mayor and frightened villagers had spent decades pretending into simpler shapes. When they reached Marrow House, the physician was still there, pale and useless by the hearth. He turned at the door opening, and the bowl fell out of his hands. It shattered on the floorboards. The vampire lord looked at him once and said, "You smell incompetent." The physician sat down very abruptly. Thomas lay upstairs burning with fever, skin gone wax pale beneath the dark branching veins that crept from his chest toward his throat. His breath came shallow and wet. The room stank faintly of iron, willow bark, sickness, and the bitter herbs Eveline had boiled until her hands shook. The vampire lord stood over the bed and went utterly still. "Interesting," he murmured. Eveline's heart dropped. "That is not the word you use before telling me he'll live. It is the word I use before telling you someone has lied to your valley very competently." She stared. He touched 2 fingers to Thomas's sternum. Thomas arched once against the mattress and coughed black into the linen at his mouth. The vampire lord's eyes narrowed. "This is not fever," he said. "It is binding rot." Eveline looked from her brother to him. "I don't know what that means." "It means someone has tied your brother's blood to an old grave marker or vow stone and turned the inheritance of your house against itself." The room spun for a second. That made no sense, which was exactly why she believed it. Nothing else about Hollow Vale had made sense in years. Not the failed crops on Marrowland alone. Not the well water blackening only near their boundary stones. Not the way old women spat at Eveline in public but still sent secretly for marrow remedies when babies would not wake. Who would do that? The vampire lord looked toward the window as though the village beyond it were a particularly tedious puzzle. "Anyone who feared what your family remembers." The physician made a small sound near the door. Both of them turned. He went whiter. There are silences that invite explanation. This was not one of them. This silence pinned. The vampire lord walked toward him with terrifying calm. "You knew." My lord, I suspected only. Never use only to soften cowardice. It offends me." The physician's mouth worked uselessly. Eveline felt something hot and violent rise in her chest. "You told me to wake him." "Yes," the physician whispered. She took a step toward him. "You knew this was not sickness." "I knew the church records were wrong. I knew the rot started after Mayor Wren took the old boundary books from your father the year before he died. I knew no herb would touch it, and I knew if anyone in this valley could read what was done to your brother, it would be the Lord below St. Vay." He was crying now, not dramatically, quietly, the way weak men do when the truth finally reaches them through the skin instead of the intellect. "I did not know if he would help," he said. The vampire lord looked bored by the tears. "I haven't decided," he said. Eveline turned on him. "Then decide faster." The words hung in the room. The physician stopped breathing. So did she, a little. The vampire lord looked at her with slow, startling focus. No one in Hollow Vale spoke to power like that and remained vertical. But something in his expression, something terrible and alive and almost approving, shifted. "You order well for a woman with no leverage," he said. "My brother is dying. I am past strategy." To her utter shock, he nodded. Then he turned back to Thomas and said, "There is a grave anchor beneath the old cemetery wall. Something of your line was used to fasten the working, bone most likely, hair if they were lazy, blood if they were theatrical." He glanced at Eveline. "I dislike theatrics in other people. Can you break it?" "Yes." Hope punched the air out of her. Then he added, "Before dawn, or he dies." There it was, the hook inside the mercy. Time. It was always time. The storm outside became their accomplice, or their witness. Eveline and the vampire lord crossed the sleeping valley under sleet and bell silence, while the physician remained with Thomas under explicit threat of dismemberment if he attempted piety instead of usefulness. The cemetery wall behind St. Vay had half collapsed years ago, ivy and rain prying apart the old mortar. The vampire lord moved through the grave rows with the certainty of a man walking a house others had clumsily rearranged during his absence. At the far edge, where the chapel shadow met the oldest stones, he stopped before a cracked angel marker and knelt. Then his hand sank wrist deep into the earth. Eveline recoiled. He did not even glance at her. "There," he said. When he pulled his hand free, mud streamed from his glove. So did a length of black ribbon wrapped around a bundle no bigger than a fist. The sight of it made Eveline's stomach turn. He unwrapped the ribbon. Inside lay a woman's finger bone, 2 iron nails, and a lock of white blonde hair tied with marrow blue. Eveline forgot how to breathe. Her mother had worn marrow blue to the day she died. The vampire lord's face went very still. "This," he said softly, "was done by someone who had access to your dead." The realization struck in fragments and then all at once. Not strangers, not ancient curses, not faceless evil from the woods. Someone local, someone trusted, someone who had stood near her mother's burial with solemn hands and private intentions. Eveline whispered, "Mayor Wren." The vampire lord closed his fist around the bundle. "Likely, not alone." He rose. The rain ran down his hair and jaw in silver lines. "He wants your house emptied," he said. "Not merely ruined. Emptied. Something beneath Marrowland matters enough that he needed the bloodline weakened, the heirs frightened, and the valley taught to blame you for your own unraveling." He crushed the bone in his bare hand, not violently, effortlessly. The air changed. The cemetery wind reversed for one impossible second, drawing inward toward his fist. The black ribbon burned away without fire. Somewhere beneath the earth, something loosened with a sound like a chain pulled through water. Then, from the house below, a howl of pain tore through the storm. Thomas. Eveline ran. The vampire lord beat her to the door. When they reached the sick room, Thomas was gasping, body arched, black veins receding beneath his skin like ink withdrawing from paper. He convulsed once, coughed red this time, bright human red, and fell back against the pillows, weeping in exhausted confusion. Alive. Alive. Eveline gripped the bedpost so hard the wood bit her palm. The physician sat down on the floor and began praying to every god he could remember. The vampire lord looked at Thomas for a moment, then at Eveline. "It's broken," he said. And because her body had been running on fear for too many hours, because relief is often more physically violent than grief, because no one had saved a Marrow in so long that the architecture for gratitude had almost gone missing inside her. Eveline sat down abruptly on the edge of the bed and laughed until she cried. When she looked up, the vampire lord was watching her with an expression she could not name. Not amusement, not tenderness, recognition of some kind, dangerous and old. "What?" she asked hoarsely. "You laugh like your grandmother." That hit harder than it should have, perhaps because he said it like loss, or memory, or proof. Dawn found Mayor Wren on the chapel steps, where the vampire lord had him pinned with one hand at the throat and an expression of such measured contempt that the gathered villagers forgot outrage in favor of fear. News had traveled fast. It always does when old power returns wearing boots instead of legend. The square below St. Vay filled before sunrise. Women with shawls pulled tight. Men pretending shock more than guilt. The priest with his cross. Hollow Vale's little architecture of convenient ignorance gathered in one place at last. Eveline came down the path with Thomas leaning weakly on her shoulder and stopped at the edge of the crowd. They turned. All of them. At the brother meant to die before dawn. At the girl who had gone into the crypt and come back with the dead at her side. Mayor Wren saw them and began shaking harder. The vampire lord did not. Good. His grip never changed. "You stole from Marrow graves," he said conversationally as if discussing weather. "You used their dead to poison their living. You turned inheritance into disease and superstition into camouflage. Explain." Wren's face had gone gray. The valley was starving. "Villages are always starving," the vampire lord said, "usually for honesty." The priest found his voice first. "My lord, if there has been wrongdoing, we can address it through proper." "Careful," said the vampire lord without looking at him. "You are standing exactly one sentence away from making yourself relevant." The priest closed his mouth. Wren tried again. "Marrow land should not remain theirs. The old deeds were never clean. The woods answer to them. The wells answer to them. Even the storms. People feared them." "People fear what they cannot cheaply own," Eveline said. The whole square went silent. Wren looked at her with something raw and bitter. "Your mother would never sell the lower fields." Because there it was. Not justice, not religion. Land. It was almost disappointing in its pettiness. He had killed around a boundary dispute and dressed it as a curse because greed prefers folklore when law becomes inconvenient. The vampire lord glanced back at Eveline, and the look in his eyes said he had already known greed would be somewhere near the center of it because greed is so often the weak man's explanation for grandeur. Thomas lifted his head weakly. "You used our mother." Wren did not answer. He didn't need to. Again. The truth stood on its own legs now. What followed might once have become a public trial. It did not. Because the vampire lord of St. Vay's Hill had woken into a valley that had buried him, defiled the dead tied to his old ally house, and nearly murdered the last Marrow heir by inches and paperwork and fear. He was in no mood for committees. By noon, the grave records were opened. The mayor's accounts were seized. 2 church wardens confessed before sunset. The physician, to his everlasting surprise, was spared because cowardice with a useful turn toward repentance occasionally interests power more than virtue without consequence. And Hollow Vale, for the first time in generations, was forced to look directly at the simple shape of what it had done. It had not been cursed by the Marrows. It had fed on them. That should have been the end. For smaller stories, it would have been. But midnight came again, and with it, the second turning. Thomas slept cleanly for the first time in days. The valley had gone quiet under the exhausted hush that follows public disgrace. Rain still tapped at the long windows of Marrow House. Candlelight moved softly over old portraits, old books, old wood polished by generations no one had properly mourned. Eveline found the vampire lord in the west gallery staring at a painting so dark with age she could barely make out the faces. "Your grandmother," he said without turning. "And me. Before the bishop incident." She came to stand beside him. The portrait showed a woman in deep blue velvet smiling like a threat wrapped in elegance, and beside her a dark man with a hand at his back, unsmiling but visibly less dead around the eyes than he seemed now. "You let yourself be painted with people," she said. "I was younger. You look exactly the same." That almost earned another one of those brief, impossible half-laughs. Almost. Then the house shuddered, not from wind, from below. Both of them went still. Eveline turned toward the floor. The vampire lord's gaze sharpened into something lethal. "That," he said, "is new." The second turning had been buried deeper than the first. Of course it had. Ren had not only poisoned the living bloodline, he had been digging. Under Marrow House ran older vaults than even Eveline knew, sealed passages from before the chapel years, before the road, before Hollow Vale became a village instead of a ring of households trying not to freeze. Her father had forbidden the lower cellar all her life and died before explaining why. Now the explanation moved under the floorboards like something waking badly. They went down with 3 lanterns and 1 spade. Thomas protested from the stairs and was ordered back to bed by both of them in such perfect, frightening unison that Eveline nearly smiled, even through the fear. The lower cellar wall had cracked behind the coal bins. Fresh dirt showed through stone. Mayor Wren had not been trying to destroy Marrowblood only to steal land. He had been trying to reach what Marrowblood protected. The vampire lord touched the crack and said a word in a language Eveline did not know. The wall opened. Behind it lay a vault no priest had blessed and no villager had likely seen in 2 centuries. Shelves of sealed jars, iron caskets, old ledgers bound in skin-dark leather, and at the center, on a pedestal of black stone, a heart-shaped crystal the color of dried roses. It pulsed once in the lantern light. Eveline recoiled. "What is that?" The vampire lord looked at it with an expression so stripped of everything but memory that she suddenly understood why a man might choose a coffin over continuing. "My heart," he said. She stared. "No." "Yes." "That is not how anatomy works. Not for you." He stepped toward the pedestal slowly, as if each foot of distance crossed a year rather than a room. "When they murdered my household," he said, "I removed it myself before sleep. There are kinds of grief even immortality should not be allowed to feed on endlessly. The crystal held the worst of my hunger and the oldest of my rage. The coffin held the rest." The room seemed to tilt. Wren had not been digging for treasure. He had been digging toward a weapon, toward leverage over the one thing in the valley more dangerous than old land rights and dead mayors. Eveline looked from the crystal to him. If he had found it, he would have died first, the vampire lord said, and probably several others around him. But eventually someone greedy enough and stupid enough would have learned to use what remained. He turned then and looked at her in a way that made every candle in the vault feel suddenly smaller. "You woke me on the right night, Miss Marrow." That should have comforted her. Instead, it made her aware, all over again, that she had opened a forbidden coffin and changed the political weather of an entire valley in under 24 hours. "What happens now?" she asked. He looked at the crystal, then at the house above them, then at her. "That," he said, "depends on whether you intend to keep inheriting ghosts or start ruling what they left you." The question landed harder than any declaration, because it was not about romance. Not yet. Not even about him. It was about her. About the fact that survival and vindication were not the same as authorship. About the terrible possibility that she might now have to become visible in a life where invisibility had at least once kept her alive. She looked at the crystal heart pulsing on its pedestal, at the vault of old hidden things, at the vampire lord who had risen from beneath the chapel, and yet somehow looked more awake standing in her cellar than he had in his own coffin. Then she said the most honest thing available to her. "I don't know how." His gaze held hers. "Neither did your grandmother," he said. "She did it anyway." He lifted the crystal with bare hands. The whole vault darkened. Lantern flames bent inward. For one suspended, impossible second, Eveline saw it. Saw him as the valley must once have seen him when he had been less myth and more ruler. Not monster. Not lover. Something older than both and more difficult. Power with memory. Power with standards. Power that had suffered enough to become deliberate. Then the darkness settled. He put the crystal into an iron case, sealed it, and turned the key. "I will not sleep again," he said. The words entered the room like a vow. Whether they were meant for her, for himself, or for the valley beyond the hill, Eveline could not tell. Maybe all three. Spring came late that year, but it came. Not miraculously. Not because curses vanish in neat moral lines once the right villain is named. Hollow Vale remained itself, suspicious, weathered, difficult, better at needing than thanking. Yet under Marrow authority, the lower fields were reopened. The well boundaries were restored. The church accounts, painfully, publicly, untangled from village governance. Thomas recovered slowly, then angrily, then with the kind of humor that only returns to people who have almost died and discovered they dislike solemnity more than weakness. And the vampire lord stayed, not in the crypt, in the east wing of Marrow House, where the shutters had not been opened in 16 years, and the servants spent 3 days trying not to faint while preparing rooms for a man their grandparents had warned them about in bedtime whispers. He was not easy company. That, Eveline discovered, was part of the appeal. He corrected bad history at dinner, insulted priests with surgical accuracy, knew where every buried deedline in the valley lay because he had signed half of them himself. And sometimes, very late, when the house had gone quiet and the candles burned low in the library, he would speak of her ancestors not as names in ledgers, but as people who laughed too loud, cheated badly at cards, rode recklessly, fell in love disastrously, and once, in one unforgettable case, threatened to stab a duke over the quality of his pears. It changed something in her, not all at once. Healing rarely respects dramatic timing, but enough. Enough that the house stopped feeling like a mausoleum she had inherited, and more like a place she might actually live inside without apologizing for it. Enough that when the villagers began coming to Marrow House openly again, not for superstition, not in secret, but with petitions, disputes, rents, requests, she stopped looking over her shoulder for permission that was no longer relevant. Enough that one evening, standing on the south terrace while dusk filled the orchard in blue shadow, she asked him the question that had been waiting under all the others. Why did you really wake? He stood beside her with one hand on the stone railing, watching the valley he had once abandoned to history, and had now, unwillingly or not, re-entered. You opened my coffin, he said. That is the practical answer. It's the accurate one. She turned to him. No. I mean, why did you choose to stay awake? You could have cured Thomas, dealt with Wren, reclaimed your heart, and gone back below ground where no one disappoints you. A long silence followed. Wind moved through the bare orchard branches. At last he said, Because when you opened the coffin, you did not ask me to avenge you. She frowned. I asked you to save my brother. Exactly. He turned then, and the full weight of his attention was such a startling, intimate thing that she almost looked away. You did not wake me for worship, or greed, or romance, or power. You woke me because someone you loved was dying, and you were willing to be terrified if terror was the only currency left. His gaze moved once over her face. There are not many people I would rise for. Fewer still I would remain for. Her pulse stumbled. It would have been easier if he had said something theatrical, claimed fate, declared obsession. Instead, he gave her truth with edges, and truth is often more dangerous than seduction because you cannot dismiss it as performance. What if I had opened the coffin for the wrong reason? She asked softly. Then, he said, you would not be standing here. The answer should have chilled her. It did. And still there was something in the shape of it she trusted more than gentler lies. The first time he kissed her, it was not beside a grave or in a storm or in some fevered moment written to impress destiny. It was in the archive room with dust on both their hands and old boundary maps spread across the table. She had just won an argument, fairly. He disliked that intensely. You are becoming inconveniently competent, he said. You say that as though it pains you. It does, she smiled. He stopped speaking. Then he crossed the distance between them with that same unnerving economy of movement and touched her face once, as if confirming she was real before committing the error. She did not move. Neither did he. That pause, room enough for refusal, room enough for fear, room enough for choice, was what made the kiss matter. Not hunger first, recognition, then hunger. Then the almost unbearable relief of wanting something after too many years of merely enduring. By summer, Hollow Vale no longer called Eveline cursed. Not because villages become noble when corrected, because they become careful when power starts eating through their old lies. Some called her lady, some called her marrow still, with all the old caution but less contempt. Children dared one another to run past the chapel hill at dusk and look for lamplight in the crypt windows, because stories never truly vanish. They only change owners. Eveline let them. She had learned something useful from the valley at last. People behave better around the possibility of being haunted. 3 months after the coffin opened, she stood in the west gallery before the old portrait of her grandmother and the vampire lord, and listened to the house breathe around her. Thomas was downstairs arguing with the steward over grain tallies. Rain tapped softly at the windows. Somewhere beyond the orchard, wolves in the upper woods were singing to evening. He came to stand behind her. She felt him before he spoke. You have her expression now, he said, looking at the portrait. My grandmother's? No, your own, the one she would have approved of. She smiled without turning. That sounds dangerously like praise. It is an observational catastrophe. Then his arms came around her waist, and because trust had become something she chose now rather than something the world occasionally failed not to break, she leaned back into him. Below the hill, Hollow Vale glowed with supper fires and lanterns and all the fragile, stubborn routines of ordinary life. Above it, the chapel bell rang once, not as warning, as evening. Eveline looked out over the land men had tried to take from her family by making fear look holy, and thought of the girl who had gone into the crypt with torn hands, a hammer, and no expectation beyond desperation. She wished she could tell that girl something simple, not that the dead would rise, not that the village lied, not even that love might follow horror into the same house and make room for itself there. Something smaller, something harder. One. You were never what they made of you. Inside the house behind her, old floorboards settled around new life. Below the chapel, the coffin stood open and empty. And beside her, the vampire lord who had woken at midnight lowered his mouth to her temple and said, in the quiet voice he seemed to reserve only for truths that mattered, "You realize, of course, that opening forbidden things is now a pattern with you." She laughed. The sound moved through the gallery like light finally learning the architecture. "Then it's fortunate," she murmured, "that this one turned out well." His hand tightened slightly at her waist. "Fortunate," he said, "is not the word I would choose." And when she turned in his arms and looked at him, really looked at the old grief, the old power, the living patience, the dangerous steadiness that had chosen not merely to wake, but to remain, she understood exactly what he meant. Some coffins hold monsters. Some hold kings. And some, when opened by the right desperate hands at the right unforgivable hour, give the world back a future it did not deserve, and a girl back to herself at last.